Victoria didn't sit at the petitioner's table the way someone asks for help. She sat the way a person sits when they already know how this ends. I'm Maya Sterling. I'm 32 years old. And I was sitting 3 feet away from my sister in a Cook County courtroom, watching her attorney lean into the microphone like he'd already written the headline. Your Honor, Miss Sterling cannot manage her own finances. Not the accounts. Not the property. Not the decisions. We are asking the court to assign everything to my client for proper management. Victoria turned her head toward me. Not to meet my eyes. Just enough to make sure it landed. She'll lose it all, she said. Clear as a weather report. The house. The car. Her savings. I'm the responsible one. I always have been. The whole time she was speaking, I had one thought. That woman is my sister. If this story sounds like something you need to hear today, stay with me. Please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. She had stolen $47,500 from my retirement account at 3 in the morning. She had fabricated psychiatric records in my name from a facility in Vermont I had never once visited. She had stood at a podium at the Art Institute and told 400 people I was having a breakdown while her attorney held my shoulder so I couldn't move. And then, in a small conference room off the courthouse corridor, she slid a document across the table. A voluntary transfer of the entire Sterling estate to her. Sign it now and this ends quietly, she said. Otherwise there'll be someone waiting from the Vermont facility by midnight. I almost signed. My hand was shaking so hard the ink splattered across the line. But my father had left something for me hidden inside an old art history book, 3 years before he passed. A USB drive with a code only I knew. The judge opened the inventory. He turned one page, then another, then he stopped. Counsel. His voice had changed. Item 12. Read that again. Victoria had no idea what our father had buried in that folder. The question is, was it enough? The cold came off Lake Michigan in sheets that January, pressing itself flat against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like something that wanted in. Maya Sterling had lived in this apartment for 3 years, and she still hadn't gotten used to the way the wind found every seam in the glass, not a whistle. Exactly, more of a low, sustained moan, the kind of sound a building makes when it's being tested. 42 stories above the Gold Coast, the lake stretched out beneath a sky the color of old pewter, its surface frozen solid for the first time in a decade. She had read about it in the Tribune 2 weeks ago, sitting in the same spot where she sat now on the low stool at the marble kitchen island, her coffee going cold in her hands. The apartment was the kind of place that looked better in photographs than it felt to live in. All clean lines and pale stone and the particular silence of rooms that cost too much to fill with anything warm. Maya had moved in after her father's first hospitalization, when it had seemed important to be close to the family's base of operations in the city. The penthouse sat in a building her father, Arthur Sterling, had purchased in the mid-90s, back when he was still building things rather than managing them. She had taken the smaller of the 2 upper-floor units. Victoria, naturally, had taken the larger. She had been awake since 4:30. The 401k statement was sitting on the counter in front of her, folded in thirds. The way it had arrived tucked inside a stack of forwarded mail from the family's main accountant, whose assistant had apparently assumed it was routine correspondence. Maya had opened it without thinking, the way you open mail when your mind is somewhere else. When you're still half inside the particular grief of losing a parent and the particular exhaustion of everything that comes after. She had read the summary line twice before she understood what she was looking at. A withdrawal. $50,000. Dated 6 weeks ago. She had not made any withdrawal. She had been in New York 6 weeks ago. At a gallery consultation she'd taken as much to stay occupied as anything else. She hadn't touched her accounts. She barely remembered to eat during those weeks, let alone manage investment documents. She set the statement down on the marble and pressed her fingers flat against the cool surface, as if the solidity of the stone might anchor her to what she was seeing. The number sat there, indifferent, printed in the clean black type of a document that didn't know or care what it was describing. $50,000. Gone. And her name, her signature authorization listed as the authorizing party. The heating system cycled on with a low hum that moved through the floors and up through the stool legs and into her bones. Outside, a gust came off the lake and the windows flexed, barely perceptibly, and the sound of it was almost a voice. Maya turned the statement over. Turned it back. The number did not change. She was still looking at it when she heard the elevator. Victoria's heels came first, always the heels, before anything else. A particular sharp click on polished stone, like a metronome set to a rhythm that belonged only to her. Maya had heard that sound her whole life and she had never once found it comforting. She folded the statement without thinking and slid it under the silk table runner near the fruit bowl. Her hands moving on their own, and she had just placed her coffee mug back over the edge of the runner when the elevator doors slid open. Victoria Sterling moved through rooms the way water moves through a landscape, not around things but over them, reshaping the air in her wake. She was 7 years older than Maya, and she wore that difference not as age but as authority. This morning she was already dressed, a charcoal wrap coat over what looked like a boardroom suit. Her dark hair pulled back in a knot so precise it seemed architectural. She set a leather portfolio on the far end of the island and opened the refrigerator with the ease of someone entering their own home. "You're up early," she said, without turning around. "Couldn't sleep." Maya kept her voice level. She watched her sister pull out a bottle of sparkling water and close the refrigerator with a soft click. "You have morning meetings?" "Always." Victoria turned, and her eyes moved over the kitchen the way they always did, cataloging, assessing, noting without appearing to note. Her gaze paused, briefly, on the silk runner, and then it moved to Maya. "You look pale." "I'm fine. You've been saying that for 2 months." Victoria crossed to the far end of the island and reached for the pill organizer sitting on the shelf below the cabinet. It was a small thing, a weekly dispenser in white plastic, the kind you might find at any pharmacy. Maya had noticed it appearing in various places around the apartment over the past few weeks. On the bathroom counter, on her nightstand once, now here in the kitchen. She had never asked where it came from. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted the answer. Victoria picked it up and set it down in front of Maya with a sound like a punctuation mark. "You missed Tuesday and Wednesday," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of genuine concern. The kind of warmth that always made Maya feel watched. "The doctor said consistency matters." "I haven't been forgetting anything." "Maya." Victoria's expression shifted barely, just a softening at the corners of her mouth, just enough to look like patience. "You've been scattered since Dad passed." "That's completely understandable. But there's no reason to let the small things pile up." She pushed the organizer slightly closer. "The bills, the accounts, let me handle them for a while. Until you're steadier." The word steadier landed somewhere behind Maya's sternum and sat there. She looked at her sister's face and saw nothing she could name. Not malice, or not only malice. Something more composed than that. Something that had been practiced until it looked effortless. She thought about the statement folded under the silk runner 3 feet away. She thought about $50,000 and her own name on a document she had never seen before today. She thought about the pill organizer and how she had never asked, not once, what it was dispensing or who had prescribed it. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug until she felt the heat of it through her palms. Her knuckles went white. "I can manage," she said. The words came out quiet. Quieter than she'd meant them to. Victoria held her gaze for a moment, then smiled a small, satisfied thing and picked up her portfolio. "Of course you can," she said. "I'll have the accountant send over the summary statements this week. You can look them over when you're feeling up to it." She was gone in the same way she always left the heels, the elevator, the doors closing on her like a curtain dropping. And then the apartment was silent again except for the hum of the heating system and the sound the lake wind made against the glass, that low, searching moan looking for the place where the seal wasn't perfect. Maya sat very still. She waited until she heard the elevator reach the lobby floor. She could feel it in some distant way through the building's frame. And then she lifted the coffee mug and pulled the silk runner aside and unfolded the 401k statement one more time. The number was still there. She looked out at the frozen lake, at the gray expanse of ice stretching toward the horizon, and for a moment she tried to make herself believe it was a bank error. An accounting mistake. Something with a simple explanation that would resolve itself with one phone call to the right person. She had spent enough of the last 2 months constructing simple explanations for things that didn't quite add up. The missing phone call from her father's old lawyer. The pill organizer appearing on her nightstand, the way Victoria had begun signing for packages addressed to Maya without mentioning it. She looked at the statement. She looked at her own name, listed as the authorizing party for a withdrawal she had never made. The reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window showed her a woman sitting alone at a marble counter in a penthouse above a frozen lake. And for just a moment she looked like someone who didn't recognize herself. She looked like someone who had been sleeping through something that had already been in motion for a long time. She folded the statement again, slowly and deliberately, and slid it into the pocket of her robe. Not a bank error. She pressed her back straight against the stool and stared at the pill organizer still sitting on the counter where Victoria had left it. And she thought, I'm not losing my mind. She's been planning this. The lake wind found another seam in the glass and pushed through it, and the whole apartment seemed to breathe in, briefly, before the seal held. The Sterling mansion sat 12 miles north of the city, in a neighborhood where the houses were set so far back from the street that you could almost believe they were shy. Arthur Sterling had bought the property in 1987, before the money had fully arrived. When he was still the kind of man who drove himself to meetings and remembered the names of his assistants' children. Maya had grown up in that house, had learned to ride a bike in the long driveway. Had broken her wrist falling out of the oak tree at the back of the property, had sat in the kitchen on 1,000 ordinary mornings eating cereal, while her father read the financial pages and hummed to himself without realizing he was doing it. It had been a home once. She wasn't sure what it was now. She drove out the next morning, telling herself she was going to pick up the last of the personal items she'd stored in her old bedroom. Telling herself that was all. The sky was the same pressed pewter as the day before, low and dense, the kind of January sky that makes the afternoon feel like early evening. She pulled into the long driveway just after noon and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house, the pale stone facade. The tall windows, the bare oak tree at the corner of the property, its branches black against the white sky. She had always loved this house. She was no longer sure she trusted that feeling. The housekeeper, Mrs. Polly, let her in with the particular warm discretion of someone who had worked for the family for 22 years and knew better than to ask questions. Maya thanked her and moved through the front hallway, past the portrait of her father that had always hung above the credenza, past the closed doors of the rooms that were always closed, toward the back corridor and the staircase. She almost missed it. She was passing the hallway table, a narrow antique near the library entrance that had always served as a catch-all for mail and keys and the accumulated paper of a busy household, when something caught her eye. A document, folded once, with a letterhead she recognized as medical. She wasn't thinking clearly enough to stop herself. She reached out and picked it up. It was a Medicare explanation of benefits. The patient name at the top was hers. The service listed was inpatient psychiatric evaluation. The facility was a clinic in Woodstock, Vermont. The date of service was 11 weeks ago. She stood in the hallway with the document in her hands and felt the particular cold of a house in winter, not the cold of outside, but the cold of a space that hasn't been fully heated, that holds the temperature of absence in its walls. 11 weeks ago she had been in Chicago. She had attended a memorial gathering for her father's former business partner. She had been seen by 40 people. She had never been to Vermont in her life. She turned the document over. The billing code on the reverse listed a psychiatric evaluation and a follow-up assessment. Both under her name. Both billed to her insurance. Her health insurance card. She reached for her wallet, already knowing the card was gone. She had noticed its absence last week and told herself she'd misplaced it. She had been telling herself a great many things lately, small, orderly explanations for things that had stopped being explainable. The library door was pulled shut, but not fully latched, and through the inch of space where it hadn't caught she could see the amber light of the desk lamp and hear voices, low, urgent, the particular pitch of a conversation meant not to carry. She recognized Victoria's voice without needing to hear the words. The other voice was male, measured, with the cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. She should have walked upstairs. She should have gotten what she came for and left. Instead, she stood in the hallway with the Medicare document in her trembling hands and tried to make sense of the words she could almost hear through the gap in the library door. Something about a petition, something about expedited filing, something about the judge's calendar in February. The grandfather clock at the end of the hallway began to chime. She counted the strokes without intending to. 12 noon. The sound moved through the house like a current and faded, and when it was gone the voices behind the library door had stopped. The door opened. Marcus Thorne stepped into the hallway and closed the library door behind him with the deliberate quietness of a man who does not want witnesses. He was perhaps 45, tall, with the kind of posture that suggested he had once been an athlete. And now channeled the same discipline into something more dangerous. He wore a dark suit and no tie and looked at Maya the way lawyers look at problems quickly, assessingly, with no particular feeling behind the assessment. "Miss Sterling," he said. She hadn't met him before. She knew the name. Victoria had mentioned her attorney in passing, the way you mention a resource you've been cultivating. She had not known he would be here, in this house, at noon on a Tuesday in January, coming out of the library where her father's desk still sat and her father's books still lined the walls. "We've already filed the emergency petition for your protection," he said, and he said it with a smile that did not touch his eyes. "You'll receive the formal notice shortly. I'd encourage you to review it carefully." She said nothing. She was aware of the Medicare document in her hand and aware that he could see it and aware that neither of them was going to acknowledge it directly. "Victoria is concerned," he continued, "as any family member would be, given the circumstances. The petition is designed to ensure continuity of care." Continuity of care. She turned the phrase over in her mind and found nothing inside it but architecture, a frame built to hold something else. "I wasn't aware a petition had been filed," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Your sister felt the situation was urgent enough to proceed." He adjusted the portfolio under his arm. "I'm sure she'll walk you through the details. In the meantime, you should know that any financial activity transfers, withdrawals, account changes will be subject to review as of the filing date." He smiled again, the same smile, and moved past her toward the front of the house. She stood in the hallway and listened to his footsteps on the marble until she heard the front door close. The clock was still now. The house held its cold silence. Through the library door she could hear nothing, no movement. No voice, nothing to confirm whether Victoria was still in there or had slipped out through another room. The house had always had too many doors. Maya looked down at the Medicare document in her hands. Her name, her insurance, a facility she had never visited, an evaluation she had never undergone. "They are building a cage around me out of paper." She understood it with sudden, horrible clarity, not as a suspicion but as a structure. The pill organizer, the 401k withdrawal, the missing health insurance card, the voices behind the library door, the attorney who greeted her by name in a house she had grown up in as though she were a visitor. Each piece was a wall, and the walls were being assembled while she watched. And she had been so deep inside the fog of grief that she had not understood until this moment what shape the structure was taking. She folded the Medicare document and pressed it into the pocket of her coat, her fingers moving fast and certain in a way the rest of her didn't quite feel yet. She did not look at the library door. She did not go upstairs to retrieve the items she had come for. She turned toward the front of the house and walked, keeping her footsteps quiet on the marble. And she did not run, she refused to run, but her hand was on the front door handle before she had fully decided to leave. And she was outside in the January cold and across the driveway and in her car with the door locked before she let herself breathe. She sat in the driveway with the engine running and the heat blasting against her frozen hands, and she thought about her father's old lawyer, a man named Gerald Frost, who had worked with Arthur Sterling for 30 years and who had always been kind to Maya. In the particular way of someone who respected her father enough to extend that respect to his family. She had tried to call him 3 weeks ago. The number had been disconnected. She had told herself it was a changed number, nothing more. She took out her phone and dialed the number again from memory. 3 rings, and then a recording, not a disconnection notice, but a new recording that said the line was no longer in service and provided no forwarding contact. She set the phone in her lap and looked at the house through the windshield. The bare oak tree at the corner. The pale stone. The tall windows with their dark glass. She could not see inside from here. She thought about Victoria behind the library door, the amber light of the desk lamp. The voice of a man who filed emergency petitions on behalf of families concerned about their members. She put the car in reverse. She needed to find Gerald Frost. She needed to find someone who was not connected to anything Victoria had built, and she needed to find them before the notice arrived. The long driveway curved toward the street, and as she turned onto it, she looked once more in the rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind her, and she thought the house I grew up in has become a labyrinth of traps. And I have been walking through it without a map. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday, slipped through her mail slot in a cream envelope with a Cook County Court seal in the upper left corner. Maya sat with it on the kitchen counter for 11 minutes before she opened it. She counted, watching the clock on the microwave, not because she was afraid of what was inside, but because she understood that once she opened it, the situation would have officially begun, and she wanted one more minute inside the world where it was still only a threat rather than a document. It was a document. In the matter of Maya Claire Sterling, respondent. Emergency petition for appointment of conservator of the person and estate. Petitioner Victoria Ann Sterling. The language was dense and precise, the kind of legal writing that sounds bureaucratic until you read it slowly enough to understand what it's actually saying. Maya read it slowly. She read it twice. The petition alleged cognitive decline, emotional instability, an inability to manage her own financial affairs. It cited what it called recent erratic behavior and a documented history of psychiatric care. It cited, specifically, an inpatient evaluation at a facility in Vermont, 11 weeks ago. The same evaluation listed on the Medicare document she'd found in the hallway of the Sterling mansion. She put the petition down on the marble counter and pressed both palms flat against the surface and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. The way her therapist had taught her 4 years ago when her anxiety had been bad, before she had the tools for it. She breathed until the pressure behind her eyes receded to something manageable. Then she picked up the petition and read it a third time. This time looking for the structure beneath the language, the particular architecture of what Victoria had built. It was, she understood, precise. Every element she had noticed over the past weeks appeared somewhere in the document, translated into legal syntax. The pill organizer had become a prescribed medication regimen supervised by the petitioner due to respondents' failure to self-administer consistently. The 401k withdrawal, her stolen $50,000, did not appear in the petition at all. Which told her something important: it had been removed from any official record, or the records themselves had been altered. The Vermont evaluation, which had never happened, appeared as documented medical history. And threaded through the whole thing, in the careful language of someone who had done this before, was a portrait of Maya Sterling. As a woman who could not be trusted with her own life. She found herself thinking about the Art Institute Gala benefit she had attended 2 weeks ago. Before the petition arrived, when she had still believed that Victoria's increasing presence in her affairs was grief expressing itself as control. She had gone because she knew half the guests, because she had curated 2 of the exhibitions on the walls. Because art had always been the place where Maya Sterling felt most fully herself. Victoria had offered to accompany her, and Maya had been grateful. And she had been grateful right up until the moment Victoria had gone to the podium. She hadn't understood it in real time. That was the part she kept returning to: how long it had taken her to understand what was happening while it was happening. The gala had been held in the grand ballroom, the chandeliers throwing their cold gold light across 400 people in evening wear, the room smelling of champagne and cut flowers and the particular warmth of a large space heated by bodies. Maya had been talking with a former colleague near the back bar when she heard Victoria's voice amplified through the room's speaker system. And she had turned toward the podium with nothing more than the mild curiosity of someone who has heard their sister's public speaking voice before. "Before we begin tonight's program," Victoria had said, her glass of champagne raised just enough to catch the chandelier light. Her voice carrying the warm gravity of someone accustomed to rooms like this one. "I want to take a moment to address something that many of you may have heard discussed in recent weeks." Maya had set down her drink. "My sister Maya has been struggling with a private breakdown since the passing of our father." Victoria's voice had not wavered. She had delivered the sentence with the tender precision of someone performing concern rather than feeling it. As a family, we've been doing everything we can to support her through this difficult time. The room's ambient noise dropped not to silence, but to that particular hush of 400 people simultaneously deciding to listen. Maya had felt the shift in the air before she fully processed the words. She had begun moving toward the podium, moving through the crowd, and she had gotten approximately 12 feet before a hand came down on her shoulder. Marcus Thorne had not needed to say anything. The pressure of his hand, firm, positioned, the hand of someone who had anticipated exactly this moment, communicated everything. He stood just behind her and slightly to her left, and his hand on her shoulder was not violent. But it was immovable, and Maya had the sudden, nauseating awareness of how this looked from the outside. A woman in the crowd, restrained, while her sister spoke from the podium about her instability. Victoria had held up a document, then she'd held it high enough for the nearest photographers to capture. But not high enough for anyone to read, which was itself a choice. I have here a medical report that explains some of the behavior many of you may have witnessed recently, she'd said. And then she had looked directly at Maya from the stage, and she had smiled, and the smile was the purest expression of malice Maya had ever seen on a human face. And it was wearing the costume of sorrow so perfectly that the 200 people between them would have seen only grief. The flashbulbs had gone off. Someone near Maya had murmured something to their companion. She had heard the words "poor thing" and had understood they were meant for her. And she had stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom with Marcus Thorne's hand on her shoulder and her voice completely absent from her body. And she had watched her reputation dissolve in the champagne glasses of the people she had spent 15 years building a professional life among. Now, in the kitchen of the penthouse, with the petition on the counter in front of her and the frozen lake beyond the glass, she let herself feel the full weight of what had been done to her at that gala. Not the surface humiliation, the public announcement, the medical report held aloft like evidence, but the deeper architecture of it. Victoria hadn't lost control that night. She had been executing. The gala had been a move, not an outburst. It had been designed to place the narrative of Maya's instability inside the mouths of 400 credible witnesses before the petition had even been served. And Maya had stood there, frozen, and let it happen. She looked at the petition on the marble counter. She looked at her name in the heading "Respondent" and felt something shift in her chest. Some particular combination of fury and clarity that she recognized, dimly, as the opposite of frozen. She needed a lawyer, not Victoria's lawyer, not anyone connected to the family's usual network of attorneys and accountants, all of whom had been orbiting Victoria's gravity for long enough that she couldn't be certain which ones had already been pulled in. She needed someone clean, someone outside the circle. Someone who could look at the petition and the Medicare document and the 401k statement and see what she saw. She also needed Gerald Frost. She had been trying to reach him through his old firm, which had since dissolved, and through two former colleagues who had worked with him in the 90s. Both had been polite and vague in the way that suggested they had already been contacted by someone who had asked them to be polite and vague. The disconnected phone line, the dissolved firm, the careful unavailability of everyone who might have known what Arthur Sterling's actual wishes had been. She pulled open her laptop and began searching. Not for Frost through the usual channels those channels were, she was coming to understand, compromised, but for the man himself, through the public record. Property records, bar association registration, alumni directories, anywhere that a retired attorney might have a footprint that hadn't yet been curated. Outside, the wind off the lake found the window again, that low insistent searching, and Maya did not look up from the screen. She was done being the woman who looked at windows. She had been the respondent for long enough. It was time to understand exactly what she was responding to. She typed, and the cursor moved, and somewhere in the public record of Cook County, Illinois, an old man who had loved her father like a brother was waiting to be found. The Cook County Courthouse on Richard J. Daley Plaza did not look like a place where lives were decided. It looked like what it was, a building from the 1960s, functional and impassive, its granite facade darkened by decades of Chicago weather. Its lobby perpetually smelling of floor wax and the coffee from the cart near the security checkpoint. Maya had been inside it twice before in her life, once for a parking dispute in her mid-20s, once for a notarization that couldn't be done anywhere else. Both times she had moved through the building with the ease of someone who has no particular stake in what happens inside it. Both times she had left without looking back. This time was different. She had been given 48 hours notice of the preliminary hearing, which her newly retained attorney, a woman named Carol Estes, 53. With an office in Wicker Park and a reputation for probate litigation that Maya had found through 2 degrees of separation from a former colleague had described as unusually short. Standard notice period is 20 days, Carol had told her on the phone, her voice carrying the controlled neutrality of someone managing their own reaction. The fact that they've pushed for an emergency hearing means they want this decided before you have time to build a defense. Maya had understood what that meant. She was beginning to understand a great many things that she should have understood sooner. Carol had advised her to say as little as possible during the preliminary hearing. To listen, to let the process reveal its own shape before trying to respond to it. Maya had agreed, and she had dressed carefully, a dark blazer, her father's small gold pin on the lapel, low heels, and she had arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early and sat in the lobby near the security checkpoint, drinking the bad coffee from the cart and watching the building fill up around her. Victoria arrived exactly on time. She came through the revolving doors in a charcoal designer suit that managed to look both professional and effortlessly expensive, her hair in its architectural knot. Marcus Thorne, half a step behind her, carrying a leather portfolio thick enough to suggest considerable preparation. She did not look at Maya in the lobby. She walked through the space with the ease of someone who has already decided how it ends. And she disappeared down the corridor toward the courtroom without breaking stride. Carol Estes met Maya outside the courtroom door and put a hand briefly on her arm. "Whatever happens in there," she said, "do not engage directly with your sister. Do not speak unless the judge addresses you. And do not sign anything." She said the last part with a particular emphasis that suggested she had reason to say it. The courtroom was smaller than Maya had imagined. Pale walls, fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below conscious awareness, wooden benches bolted to the floor. A raised bench at the front behind which Judge William Vance sat reviewing documents with the efficient focus of a man who had spent 30 years doing exactly this. He was 62 and looked it not old exactly, but settled, the kind of face that had absorbed a great deal of human difficulty and arrived at something resembling equanimity on the other side. He did not look up when Maya and Carol entered. Victoria and Marcus Thorne were already at the petitioner's table, their documents arranged with the precision of a prepared presentation. Maya took her seat at the respondent's table and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at the fluorescent lights and breathed. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. She would remember it afterward in fragments rather than sequence the sound of Marcus Thorne's voice reading the petition's allegations into the record. The particular word incapacity appearing in his sentences like a recurring chord, Judge Vance's face as he read the attached medical documentation. Carol's measured objections to the expedited timeline. The way the bailiff stood near the door with his arms at his sides and his expression arranged into professional neutrality. And Victoria. During the 40 minutes of the hearing, Maya allowed herself to look at her sister 4 times. The first time, Victoria was consulting quietly with Marcus Thorne. The second time, she was handing a document to the court clerk with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. The third time, she was watching the judge with an expression of composed patience that looked, from across the room, like genuine concern. The fourth time, the last time their eyes met, Victoria held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds her expression did not change, not in any way that someone watching from the outside would have been able to describe. But something moved through her eyes that Maya recognized with the absolute certainty of 32 years of shared history. It was the look of a person who has already won and knows it and is waiting, with real pleasure, for the other person to understand it too. The judge had set a schedule. A full conservatorship hearing in 3 weeks. He had accepted, provisionally, the medical documentation attached to the petition. He had noted, in the dry language of a man who had seen every variety of family catastrophe, that the respondent's access to the estate accounts would be restricted pending the full hearing. He had not ruled on anything permanent. He had, however, ruled on enough. After the hearing, Carol pulled Maya into a small conference room off the main corridor and closed the door and said, carefully, We have 3 weeks to build a response. I need everything you have, every document, every discrepancy you've identified, anything your father may have told you about his intentions for the estate." Maya nodded. Carol left to file a preliminary objection, and Maya sat alone in the conference room on a hard wooden chair staring at the wall, and after a while, she became aware that someone had opened the conference room door. Victoria came in and closed the door behind her and stood with her back to it. And she looked at Maya with the expression of a woman who has set something in motion and is watching it move exactly as planned. She had a single pen in her hand. She set it on the table between them with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the small, quiet room. "The voluntary transfer paperwork is already drawn up," Victoria said. Her voice was conversational, almost gentle. "If you sign before the full hearing, we can keep the fraud allegations out of the record. It's a cleaner outcome for both of us." She tilted her head slightly. "Or I have the bailiff escort you to a psychiatric hold while the judge reviews the medical documentation. Your choice, Maya, but you should make it today." Maya looked at the pen. She thought about the 401k statement under the silk runner on the kitchen counter. She thought about her name on a Medicare document for a facility she had never visited. She thought about a ballroom full of people watching her dignity dissolve while her sister smiled from a podium. She thought about the hard wooden bench and the fluorescent lights and the word respondent printed above her name in the heading of a legal document she had not asked to be part of. She picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking, she could feel it in her fingers and her wrist and her elbow. A trembling that moved through her arm like a current, and when she brought the pen to the document, the ink made a small, irregular mark, not a signature, just the evidence of her hand against the paper. Ink splattered like tears across the first line. She put the pen down. She looked at the elevator bank visible through the conference room window, the only exit from this floor, guarded by 2 members of what she now understood to be Victoria's private security. Both of them positioned with the casual authority of men who have been told exactly where to stand. "I need to speak with my attorney," Maya said. Victoria's expression did not change. She reached over and picked up the pen and slid it into the breast pocket of her jacket and turned toward the door. "You have until end of day," she said. And she left. Maya sat alone in the conference room with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee pressing in from the corridor. And she looked at the document in front of her, the voluntary transfer, already drawn up, waiting for her name. And she felt the full weight of the bottom of a world she had not known she was falling through. She was a ghost in a city she had grown up in. She had no access to her accounts, no phone without Victoria's surveillance software on it. She had understood this about the phone 2 days ago, and had switched to a prepaid, and the one lawyer she had hired in the past 72 hours was somewhere down the corridor, filing an objection that would buy 3 weeks but not more. She had 3 weeks. She closed her eyes, and in the dark behind them she saw the frozen lake from the penthouse window, that gray expanse of ice stretching toward a horizon she couldn't quite see, and she thought something is under the ice. Something Dad left. I know it because I know him. I have always known him. She opened her eyes. She needed to find it before the ice melted. Friends, let's take a breath together for just a moment. Maya Sterling came into this story as a grieving daughter, a woman still raw from loss, trying to make sense of a world that had just lost its center. And in the span of 4 sequences, we've watched that grief get weaponized against her. A stolen withdrawal quietly buried in paperwork. Medical records fabricated in her name. A public humiliation engineered in a ballroom full of people she trusted. And now a courthouse, a pen pressed into her shaking hand, and a sister who has turned the machinery of the law itself into the walls of a cage. If you've ever felt like the person closest to you knew exactly where your vulnerabilities were, and chose to use them, then you understand why Maya's story cuts so deep. There's a particular kind of fear in realizing that the threat isn't coming from a stranger. It's wearing a familiar face. It knows your father's house. It knows which pill organizer to leave on your nightstand. But here's what we know about Maya that Victoria doesn't. She's her father's daughter. And Arthur Sterling didn't leave her unprotected. He left her something. She just hasn't found it yet. Coming up, the search begins. The truth surfaces, and a dead man's love becomes the most powerful weapon in the room. Stay with us. There is a particular quality to memory when you are desperate. It sharpens in ways ordinary recollection doesn't, pulling forward details that seemed unremarkable when they were formed, illuminating them now with the particular light of necessity. Maya had always remembered her father the way she supposed most people remembered someone. They loved in impressions and atmospheres rather than specific inventory. The smell of his study, old leather and pipe tobacco, and the particular mustiness of books that had been read many times. The sound of him moving through the house in the early morning, quiet and deliberate, as if he were always trying not to wake anyone. The way he looked at her when he was proud of her, not with effusion, but with a quality of stillness, as though he were memorizing something. She had not, until now, remembered the afternoon in the library with the specificity it deserved. It had been 3 years ago. Late October, early evening, the light coming through the library windows at the low angle of autumn, filling the room with something amber and provisional. Her father had been in his worn leather chair, the one he'd had since before Maya was born, its arms polished smooth by decades of the same elbows. Its cushion shaped permanently to the particular geography of his body. He'd had a pill organizer in his hands, turning it over as he spoke, the way he always handled small objects when he was thinking. Absent-mindedly, as a kind of tactile punctuation. "Your sister sees people as balance sheets," he had said. He said it without particular drama, the way he delivered the things he was most certain about as simple statements of observed fact. "If I'm gone, she'll come for yours." She had not wanted to believe him. She had believed him. He had reached into the shelf behind him, the third shelf, the one with the art history texts arranged chronologically, the shelf she had organized herself as a teenager, and removed a copy of Modern Art. A critical history that she had given him for his 65th birthday. He had opened it to the back coverboard. Taped inside, in a small paper sleeve, was a USB drive no larger than a thumb. "The code is the date," he had said. "The first gallery. You remember." She had remembered. His first gallery, a small commercial space in River North, now long closed. That he had rented on a 30-day lease in the spring of 1979 to show the work of 3 Chicago artists he believed in before anyone else did. The opening had been April 14th. She knew the date the way she knew her own birthday. He had told her the story of that gallery every year of her childhood. Because it was the story he told when he wanted to explain what it meant to believe in something before it had been proven. "I've set a structure in the trust," he had said, and his voice had been careful in the way of a man choosing words precisely. "If she sues you for control, she triggers something. She won't know it until it's already happened." She had not asked him to explain further. She had understood him to mean that he had planned for this, that the planning existed somewhere in the formal documentation of his estate. And she had believed that believing him was sufficient. She had taken the USB drive and placed it in her bedside drawer and told herself she would look at it when the time came. And then she had spent 3 years hoping the time wouldn't come. The time had come. In the present, in the cold, precise present of a prepaid phone in a coat pocket and a conservatorship petition with her name at the top. Maya sat in a chair in a public library branch in Lincoln Park and felt the memory of that October evening settle into her chest like ballast. She felt her father's presence in it, not as loss but as instruction. He had known. He had been this specific, this deliberate, this far ahead of the sequence of events. He had loved her enough to plan for something neither of them wanted to say out loud. She breathed in, and in the breath she caught something, not a real smell, nothing as concrete as that, but the memory of a smell. Old leather, pipe tobacco, books read many times. She felt her spine straighten. The USB drive was still in her apartment. She had moved it from the bedside drawer to a small box in her closet 6 months ago, when she was reorganizing. She knew exactly where it was. She had a prepaid phone that Victoria couldn't access and a library computer terminal 2 feet in front of her. And 3 weeks before the conservatorship hearing would turn provisional restrictions into permanent ones. She thought about what her father had said about the trust. If she sues you for control, she triggers something. She had not asked what that meant in legal terms because at the time she had not needed to know. Now she needed to know everything. She opened the library browser and looked at the screen, and the cursor blinked in the search field, and she thought Dad knew. He loved me enough to plan for her hate. And the plan is already in motion. I just have to find it. She typed the name of her father's first gallery. April 14, 1979. She would not need to hope anymore. She would need to work. The USB drive was in her coat pocket when she sat down at the library terminal the next morning, arrived 40 minutes before the branch opened. Waiting in the January cold on the steps outside with her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup and her breath making small clouds in the air. When the doors unlocked, she went directly to the computer stations at the back of the reference section, the ones partially screened by the tall shelving units, away from the main floor, and she plugged the drive in and she typed the date. April 14, 1979. The drive opened. She had not known what she expected to find. Some part of her had anticipated something symbolic, a letter, perhaps, her father's handwriting on a digital document. The kind of thing you imagine a loving father leaving. What she found instead was more useful. It was a folder organized with the precision of a man who had been managing complex financial structures for 40 years. Labeled in plain text. No drama, just documentation. The first file she opened was a series of digital access logs, IP address records attached to her 401k account, time-stamped and formatted. She had to look at them twice before she understood what she was seeing. The withdrawals, not just the $50,000 she had found on the statement, but 3 additional transactions she hadn't known about, smaller amounts spread across 4 months. Each one had originated from the same IP address. A private network address she didn't recognize. She screenshotted the logs on the prepaid phone and kept reading. The second file was a document she had never seen before, but recognized immediately from her conversation with Carol Estes, an advanced designation of conservator, dated 18 months ago, notarized and signed by both Maya and Arthur Sterling. In it, Arthur had formally designated Maya as the sole conservator of his person and estate in the event of incapacity, and had explicitly disqualified, by name, Victoria Ann Sterling from any fiduciary role related to the Sterling Family Trust. The document had been prepared by Gerald Frost. She sat with this for a moment, the name appearing in the file header like a door opening, and then she kept reading. Gerald Frost had notarized the designation himself. He had also, according to the file's metadata, transmitted a copy to a second attorney, a woman in Springfield, whose name Maya didn't recognize, as a backup custodian. Off the grid, outside Victoria's network, deliberately placed where it couldn't be quietly dissolved the way Frost's own firm had been dissolved. The third file was the one her father had called the structure. She read it carefully, and then she read it again, and then she sat back in the library chair and looked at the fluorescent tubes overhead, and felt something happening in her chest that took her a moment to identify. It was the sensation of a weight she had been carrying for weeks, months, being redistributed. Not removed, redistributed, landing somewhere she could manage it. Her father had embedded what estate attorneys call a good faith clause in the Sterling Family Trust. The clause stipulated that any beneficiary who filed a legal action to contest the trust's designated succession, or who sought to have the primary beneficiary declared legally incapacitated without documented cause, would trigger an automatic forfeiture of their own share of the estate, to be reallocated to charitable foundations Arthur had named in a rider attached to the trust. Victoria had filed the conservatorship petition 3 weeks ago. She had triggered the clause the moment she filed. She did not know it yet. The clause had been written with sufficient precision that it required a formal reading before a probate judge to take effect. And it would only be triggered in connection with the advanced designation document, which Victoria had presumably never known existed. Gerald Frost had been the architect. Arthur Sterling had been the patron. And Maya, without fully understanding what she was carrying, had been holding the key for 3 years inside a book about modern art on a shelf she had organized as a teenager. The printer at the reference desk was available. She walked over and loaded her documents into the print queue, the access logs, the advanced designation, the relevant section of the trust with the good faith clause highlighted in the preview. The printer engaged with a low, mechanical sound that moved through the quiet library like the opening of something. And she stood beside it as the pages came out warm and slightly curled, and she took them in both hands. She pressed them against her chest. She went back to the terminal and composed a single email to Carol Estes, from the prepaid phone's anonymous account, with the documents attached as photographs, and she wrote, "I have what we need. I also need to find a man named Gerald Frost. His firm dissolved, but he filed documents 18 months ago with a co-custodian in Springfield. I'll explain everything when we meet. Then she took out her prepaid phone and made a call she had been working toward for 4 days. The number had come from the third file, a personal contact listed by her father as Gerald Frost's emergency line, separate from his firm. The kind of number a man keeps for situations that require discretion. She dialed it and listened to it ring twice, and then a voice answered, older, a little rough at the edges, but immediately alert. Frost, the voice said. She closed her eyes. Mr. Frost, she said, my name is Maya Sterling. Arthur was my father. I found the USB drive. A pause. And then, quieter, I was wondering when you'd call. She exhaled. The warm pages were still pressed against her chest, the ink barely dry, and outside the library windows. The Chicago winter was the same gray and relentless thing it had been for months, and she thought the hunter just walked into the snare Dad and I laid years ago. She just doesn't know it yet. The blue light of the monitor screen reflected in her eyes like cold fire, and for the first time in months, she did not look away from it. Judge William Vance had been on the Cook County probate bench for 19 years, and in those 19 years, he had developed an economy of expression that most attorneys found either reassuring or unnerving, depending on whether they were the party with better documentation. He did not waste words. He did not signal his conclusions before he reached them. He read what was in front of him and he responded to what was in front of him, and in the courtroom. He ran with the precise neutrality of a man who understood that his job was not to decide who deserved sympathy but to decide what the evidence said. He had the estate inventory open on the bench in front of him. It had been Carol Estes's motion filed with the Springfield co-custodian's verified copy of the advanced designation. Filed with the digital access logs obtained from Arthur Sterling's estate account provider. Filed with Gerald Frost's sworn affidavit. Confirming the chain of custody for every document that had prompted Judge Vance to order the full inventory. Not the preliminary inventory Victoria's team had submitted. A court-ordered independent inventory, conducted by an accountant appointed by the court and unconnected to either party. The kind of inventory that does not know who it is supposed to protect. Victoria sat at the petitioner's table in a cream suit today, her hair in its usual architectural knot. Marcus Thorne had his portfolio open and his pen in his hand. They had arrived, as always, precisely on time, and they had arranged their materials with the focused precision of a team that had never, in Maya's observation, entered a room without believing they would leave it on the better side of whatever they had come to decide. Maya sat at the respondent's table beside Carol Estes and kept her hands still in her lap and looked at the judge. Judge Vance turned a page. He turned another. He found what he was looking for, she could tell by the slight stillness that came over him. A brief pause in the motion of a man who was generally always moving, and he looked at the page for a long moment. I want to address item 12 of the inventory, he said. His voice carried in the courtroom without effort, the voice of someone who had long since stopped needing to project. Counsel for the petitioner, can you explain the transfer notation on line 12C? Marcus Thorne set down his pen. Your Honor, that transfer represents a. It represents, the judge said, in the tone of a man who does not require completion. A transfer of $47,500 from the respondent's personal retirement account to a private account registered to Victoria Ann Sterling, executed 6 weeks prior to the filing of the conservatorship petition, at 3:07 in the morning. From an IP address that the court's technical analyst has confirmed belongs to the petitioner's home network. The courtroom was very quiet. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Kowalski who had been reading the inventory aloud in sections, looked at the document in his hands and then at the judge, and Judge Vance gave him a slight nod, and Kowalski read item 12 into the record in his flat, unhurried voice, the account number, the transfer amount, the timestamp, the IP address. Victoria's hands were flat on the petitioner's table. From where Maya sat, she could see the tendons in her sister's wrists. Ms. Sterling, Judge Vance said, and for the first time, the title was addressed not toward Maya, but toward Victoria, and the distinction had weight. You filed this petition on the grounds that your sister was incapable of managing her own financial affairs. Victoria opened her mouth. The judge raised one hand. It was a small gesture. He did it without looking up from the inventory. The inventory, he said, suggests a different picture. It shows a 401k withdrawal made without the account holder's authorization. It shows medical documentation submitted to this court that appears to reference treatment the respondent never received, at a facility she never attended, billed to an insurance account whose physical card was removed from her possession. He looked up. It shows a pattern of activity that is not consistent with protecting a vulnerable family member. It is consistent with something considerably less benign. Marcus Thorne had put down his pen. Carol Estes touched Maya's arm once, briefly, and Maya stood. She had prepared for this moment and she had not prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed what she would say and now that she was standing, the rehearsal felt irrelevant. What remained was something simpler and older than preparation. She crossed to the bench and presented the advanced designation. The original, with Gerald Frost's notarization, with the Springfield co-custodian's verification, with the chain of custody intact. She presented the section of the Sterling Trust containing the good faith clause, with the relevant passage flagged by a yellow marker in Carol's handwriting. Judge Vance read it. He read it twice. He looked at Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at the advanced designation on the judge's bench, and her expression for the first time in Maya's memory had no costume on it. No composed patience, no performed sorrow, no architectural calm. It was the face of a woman watching something she believed to be finished turn out to be unfinished. And it was, in its own way, the most honest thing Maya had ever seen her sister's face do. The gavel came down. The sound was not loud. Gavels in working courtrooms are rarely loud. It is not a dramatic sound so much as a conclusive one. A sound that exists to mark the moment when deliberation ends and record begins. But in the quiet of this particular courtroom, on this particular afternoon, it was the loudest thing Maya had heard in months. Judge Vance suspended the conservatorship petition pending a fraud investigation. He ordered the immediate restoration of Maya's account access. He flagged the fabricated medical documentation for referral to the state's attorney's office. And he looked at Victoria, across the courtroom, with the particular expression of a man who has seen every variety of human behavior in 19 years on the bench. And has arrived, in this instance, at something close to disdain. Maya turned. Victoria was still at the petitioner's table, and Marcus Thorne had angled himself slightly away from her, a small but unmistakable physical withdrawal. The posture of a lawyer calculating distance from liability. Victoria sat alone in the geometry of that withdrawal, in her cream suit, with her hands still flat on the table, and she looked at Maya. Maya held her sister's gaze. "The inventory just testified against you, sister," Maya said. She said it quietly. She said it without anger. She said it the way you say a simple, settled fact, the way her father had always spoken. The things he was most certain about, without drama, without performance, with only the weight of what was true. Victoria said nothing. The weight that had been sitting behind Maya's eyes and in her chest and in her shoulders for the past 3 months. The weight of a woman falling through a world she hadn't known was giving way, lifted. Not all at once. Not in a flood. In the way that real things shift gradually, and then all at once, and then quietly, like ice breaking up on a lake in the slow approach of spring. She walked out of the courtroom with Carol Estes beside her. And the corridor smelled of floor wax, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and she did not look back. Michigan Avenue in late March is a different thing than Michigan Avenue in January. The difference is not dramatic. Chicago does not do dramatic transitions. It does slow relentings, grudging concessions to warmth made 1 degree at a time, but it is real. The snow retreats from the sidewalk edges first, then from the planters, then from the ledges of the buildings, and what's left behind is the particular gray-brown of a city emerging from itself. Raw and provisional, the first tentative evidence of something that hasn't quite arrived yet. Maya had signed the gallery lease on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of March. The space was on the ground floor of a building she had walked past 100 times without ever stopping to look at. A narrow storefront with high ceilings and good north light and walls that had most recently been used for a framing shop and before that, according to the landlord, for a small architectural practice. It smelled of plaster and the particular mineral dryness of a room that had been closed for a while. She had walked through it the first time with Carol Estes beside her and a measuring tape in her hand. And she had stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow circle and thought yes. The desk was a simple thing, a wooden library table she'd found at an estate sale in Pilsen. Broad and solid, with the slight roughness of a surface that had been used for actual work rather than display. She had positioned it near the back of the main room, facing the windows, so that she could look up from whatever she was working on and see the street. She had not had a desk of her own for 3 months. She had not understood until she had this one again how much of her sense of herself had been organized around having a place to sit and work. The bank statement was on the desk. She had printed it herself, that morning, from the account that had been restored to her full access 6 days after the conservatorship petition was suspended. The numbers were her numbers, not a record of what had been taken, not an accounting of damage. But a current statement of an account that was hers and that no one else had touched, and looking at it she felt something she had not felt in months, the simple, factual reassurance of a document that told the truth. She reached into her jacket pocket and found what she was looking for. Her father's fountain pen had been in the credenza at the Sterling mansion, in the drawer where he had always kept it, a Mont Blanc with a gold nib, old enough that the barrel had worn smooth from years of being picked up and set down. She had retrieved it the week after the hearing, when the house had reverted to her oversight and Victoria was no longer living there. Mrs. Polly had handed it to her without being asked, with the quiet understanding of a woman who had watched the Sterling family for 22 years and knew which things mattered. She had not been ready to use it until today. She uncapped it and set the cap on the desk and looked at the lease, not the bank statement, which was just a document, but the lease, which was an action, and she placed the pen against the signature line and felt, for just a moment, the weight of the thing. Not the legal weight. The legal weight had been managed, carefully, by Carol Estes and Gerald Frost and an accountant from Springfield and a Cook County judge named Vance, who read inventories with the rigor of a man who understood what was in them. The other weight, the weight of a name written in a document that said, "I am here. This is mine. I am beginning." The ink moved dark and smooth across the page. She signed it and set the pen down with a quiet click and sat back and looked at the signature and found it steady. Her hand had not shaken. She had not spilled the ink. The letters of her name were clear and even, and they said what they had always said, and for the first time in a very long time they said it without apology. Outside, through the gallery windows, Michigan Avenue was doing what it did in late March, moving, full of its own noise and purpose, cabs and pedestrians and a delivery truck. Making a difficult turn, the ordinary clamor of a city that does not slow down for anyone's private reckoning. The sun was low but present, coming through the windows at an angle that laid a long pale rectangle across the concrete floor and the edge of the desk and the back of her hand. She let it warm her for a moment. She had been following the news about Victoria with the detachment of a woman who has removed herself from a situation's center and can watch its edges from a distance. The fraud investigation had moved faster than she'd expected. Federal financial fraud tends to when the documentation is as clean as Gerald Frost had made it. A brief in the Tribune's legal column had run 10 days after the hearing. Victoria Sterling, venture capitalist and daughter of late billionaire Arthur Sterling, faces federal fraud charges in connection with an alleged conservatorship scheme targeting her younger sister. Asset freeze pending arraignment. Her firm paused. The architectural knot and the cream suit and the portfolio thick enough to suggest considerable preparation, all of it on hold. All of it waiting for a process that would unfold in its own time with its own particular patience. Maya did not feel satisfaction, exactly. She felt something quieter than that. The particular quiet of a thing that has been set right, not restored to what it was before. Because you cannot restore things to what they were before, but resolved, completed, brought to the ending it was always moving toward. She looked at her reflection in the gallery window, the sunlight behind her, the pale walls of the new space on either side. Her own face looking back at her, and she smiled. It was, she thought, a strange thing to be 32 and feel as though you were beginning. Most of what she knew about beginning suggested it was something that happened earlier, when you were less certain of the cost. But here was the fact of it regardless, the pen on the desk. The ink on the lease, the north light coming through the windows, the smell of fresh plaster and possibility. Here was the city, still moving. Here was the desk, solid and real. Here was her name, in her handwriting, on a document she had chosen. She picked up the pen again, not to sign anything, just to hold it, and felt the weight of it in her hand. The particular weight of her father's object, worn smooth by his years of picking it up and setting it down. She thought about him in the library in October, the amber light, the book about modern art, the USB drive in its small paper sleeve. She thought about him saying, "I've set a structure," in the calm, deliberate voice of a man who had decided, long before the end. What kind of love was worth the effort of planning? She placed the pen down with a steady, quiet click. Freedom isn't a gift. She understood this now with the clarity of someone who had earned the understanding through its opposite. It isn't given, and it isn't inherited, and it cannot be taken from you permanently if you know where to look for it. It is a signature. It is a choice. It is a name written in your own hand on a document that says, "From this point, I begin." The sun moved another degree through the windows, and the rectangle of light on the floor shifted, and outside the city carried on with its indifferent, magnificent noise, and Maya Sterling sat at her desk in her new gallery on Michigan Avenue and began to plan what she would put on the walls. Friends, how did this one sit with you? I want to ask you that sincerely, because a story like Maya's doesn't leave you the way a simple tale does. It stays somewhere in the chest, doesn't it? The way grief can be turned into a weapon against the very person it's supposed to protect. The way a signature can be forged, a medical history invented, a reputation dismantled in the ballroom of an institution. You loved all before the person it's being done to has even found the right words for what's happening. Maya's story is about a kind of betrayal that goes deeper than money or legal documents. It's about someone who knew you, really knew you, your vulnerability, your grief, the specific texture of your loss, and chose to use that knowledge as a tool. We've all known someone like Victoria. Maybe not in a penthouse in Chicago. Maybe in a kitchen, or a boardroom, or a family meeting after a funeral. The person who moves into the space that loss creates, and begins, quietly, systematically, to reshape it in their own interest while wearing the language of concern. It is among the oldest and most painful varieties of human behavior. And the reason it works as often as it does is precisely because the person experiencing it is already hurting. You are already looking for evidence that the people around you are good. You want the pill organizer to be kindness. You want the interest in the accounts to be care. What I love about Maya, what I think we all love about her, is that she did not defeat Victoria through anger. She defeated her through her father's love. Arthur Sterling had loved his younger daughter clearly enough to understand that love, in the end, has to be practical. It has to plan ahead. It has to leave something behind that can protect the person it belongs to when it's no longer there in person to do it. The USB drive in the art history book. The good faith clause in the trust. The backup custodian in Springfield. A dead man's love, as Maya understood it, was the only weapon she had left, and it turned out to be more than enough. There's a lesson here for all of us, I think. Not about legal documents, though perhaps we should all know a little more about those than we do. The deeper lesson is about what we leave behind for the people we love. Not money, not property, but structure. The kind of careful, thoughtful preparation that says, "I see what you might face. I see who might come for you. And I am going to do everything in my power, now, while I still can, to make sure you have what you need to stand up to it." We all face moments where we have to choose who we are. Arthur Sterling chose who he was, in an October library, with an art history book and a small USB drive. Maya chose who she was, in a cold courthouse, with a shaking hand that refused to finish the signature. Both choices mattered. Both choices held. I hope this story brought you a little comfort and something to hold on to. And if you've been watching all the way through, thank you. Truly. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you love or someone you've had to stand up to, or someone you're still figuring out how to face, leave a comment. I read every single one. Please subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and hit that like button on your way out. Until next time, take care of each other.